I'm David Levi Strauss, the chair of the graduate program in art criticism and writing here at the School of Visual Arts. This is the second in our fall series of lectures. Peter Sheldall is coming next month, November 18th, with Of Ourselves and of Our Origins, Subjects of Art. Lynne Tillman is the author of 5 novels, 3 collections of short stories, 1 book of essays, a book about Warhol's factory, and a history of the legendary bookshop Books and Company. And she's got a new collection of stories that's coming out in the spring, in April, called Someday This Will Be Funny. George Saunders called her last novel, American Genius, a comedy, a kind of Tristram Shandy for our time, if Tristram were American and institutionalized. Her previous novel, No Lease on Life, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Fiction and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. This series is focused on art criticism and writing in relation to art, and Lynn has carved out a particular place in that conjunction, and I'd like to try to concentrate on that part of her writing life tonight. That may turn out to be quixotic or even wrong-headed, since Lynn doesn't draw a strict distinction between her fiction and her criticism. In fact, she's made a point of complicating that distinction. I think I first heard about Lynn's work from Kathy Acker in San Francisco, who pointed me toward a little book called Madame Realism that had been published in 1984 with short texts by Lynn and drawings by Kiki Smith. The drawings and the texts did something together that excited me very much. 8 years later, just as I was about to leave San Francisco for New York, 2 books appeared: the Madame Realism Complex by Lynn from Semiotext, and Beyond Recognition by Craig Owens, edited by Lynn, Scott Bryson, Barbara Kruger, and Jane Weinstock. Both of these books had a big impact on anyone making and thinking about art at the time. 8 years after that, in 2000, I came to teach in the MFA studio program at Bard College, where Lynn welcomed me with open arms, and I got to see firsthand how she responded to art of all kinds with a sharp eye and intellect. Patrick McGrath called Lynn a formidable critical intellectual, and also noted that she has a true talent for friendship. I'm privileged to have been the beneficiary of both of those traits. Please welcome Lynne Tillman.
Okay. Well, I'm very honored to be in this series, and very honored that David Levi Strauss invited me, and also to talk about my writing, and particularly my writing in relationship to contemporary art. So I'll just get started. This is going to be a talk a bit in fragments, because I'm going to read from different pieces of mine and then go back to the talk I've written for tonight. So I hope it adds up to something. Words are images. If I say crying, you see something. If I say red, you see red. I see red. If I say a crying baby against a red background, an image forms in your mind. You draw an image. We all draw images. Our images will be different from each other's. When I add an Asian infant aged 3 months, tears dotting his face, lying on the floor against a red cloth backdrop in a photographer's studio, even with added detail, the images we draw will be different. And if that image existed, each of us would still see something different. In her essay on craftsmanship, which came from a BBC radio talk she gave in 1936, and her voice can be heard, it's the only tape recording of her voice that exists of Virginia Woolf. in a series titled Words Fail Me. The BBC did a series called Words Fail Me on the radio. Virginia Woolf wrote, "Words don't live in dictionaries. And how, she asked, do they live in the mind? There it is, strangely, much as human beings live, ranging hither and thither, falling in love, meeting together. It is true they are much less bound by sentiment and convention than we are. Royal words mate with commoners, English words marry French words, German words, Indian words." Words are not useful, Virginia Woolf claimed, because they cannot be pinned down, and yet that is why they live on and on. When you open the dictionary to find out what a word means, other words are used to define it. Then there are synonyms, words like it, but not exactly. Language is, prosaically, a vertiginous hall of words. One can never get to the end of meaning. There is no end to it. Words define themselves, and then they're used to describe each other and everything else, including visual art. When I decided not to write traditional art criticism, it was a decision with many determinants. I was a fiction writer. I wanted to feature fiction and narrative. I did not want to use words as a vehicle for another medium. I wanted to foreground words and story. I was not a trained art historian or art critic, and I was insecure. The first Madame Realism story to appear in an art magazine, the second appearance of Madame Realism, Levi mentioned the first, that was a chapbook with Kiki Smith, was published in Art in America. It was called Madame Realism Asks, What's Natural About Painting? Now that was 1986, and I want to acknowledge and remember Craig Owens, who died of AIDS in 1990, a formidable, brilliant, important thinker, one of the first on postmodernism in art. He asked me to write on Renoir. When I said I wasn't an art critic, he said, "We know you're a fiction writer." It was for a symposium on Renoir in the magazine, and I came up with what I came up with. I'll read you a bit from it. And Elizabeth Baker, Art in America's superb editor-in-chief for many years, agreed to publish it, and many wouldn't have. So I went to the museum in Boston to see this huge Renoir show, which was probably at that point the most popular show that Boston, this museum, the big museum in Boston, had ever had. And I carried a small tape recorder with me, and I wore headphones. Now remember, this is 1986, as if I were hearing a docent speaking. And in fact, I was recording conversations. And to make this even more ridiculous, I'm 5'2", and I was with Craig Owens, who's 6'7", and we're kind of walking along together. Anyway, I want to read some bits to you from this piece, which is the second Madame Realism. And I'm just going to jump into the middle. Madame Realism is looking at this exhibition. Madame Realism followed a museum instructor whose students were trailing her with the determination of ducklings after their mother. The woman was saying something about the differences between the 18th and 19th centuries, but became confused as to whether the 18th century meant the 1800s or the 19th century, the 1800s. Madame Realism's heart went out to her on account of this temporary, ordinary lapse, and she wondered how this might affect the students' imprinting. The instructor recovered quickly and said, "You have to look for the structure. The painting, remember, is flat." It wasn't hard to remember that these paintings were flat, she thought, and stood in front of a painting of onions. Renoir's onions are flat, she said to herself. His onions. It's funny that in the language of painting, what someone paints becomes his, or sometimes hers, his nudes, his people. Skipping a little. Two women were deep in conversation, and Madame Realism eavesdropped with abandon. The first woman was saying, he had an apartment near his dealer's, and his wife didn't know about it, and he had to distort her face so that she wouldn't know who the model was. So he made the faces like penises and vaginas. The faces, the second woman said. Yes, said the first, like the nose coming out, that's a penis. They were talking about Picasso, Madame Realism figured out, because whatever you might say about Renoir, his noses didn't look like penises. Although, upon viewing a late painting of nudes, she wanted to rush over those women and tell them that a Renoir elbow looked like a breast, or like a peach. Peaches and breasts. Peaches are much more like flesh than apples, or for that matter, onions, a bowl of breasts, a still life. Jumping ahead again. Wanting very much to leave and eat, to go home, tired of the insistent flow in front of paintings of which she was very much a part, Madame Realism was entrapped by another conversation, carried on by two men and a woman. The first man to speak was waving his arms rather excitedly, saying, "The washerwomen were square. He was painting things as if they were rigid, fixed in a space that wouldn't move." The woman responded, "You can see why his paintings would appeal to the common man and woman. His people are just so unself-conscious." The first man countered, "But his talent was remarkable." The second man asked, "In his notes and letters, is there a more cerebral quality?" The first man answered, "No, and he wasn't a happy person." The woman exclaimed, "But his paintings have such joy." Both men said vitality in unison. "It's often true," said the first man. "He was a very cranky guy from a poor family. The sensuality in all his paintings, just wishful thinking." The woman said, "He was like Mozart, a basic talent, but without intellect." The first man threw his arms out again and implored, "But he was a natural flowing talent. It just flowed out." The second man said, "Genius." At Genius, Madame Realism walked out of the exhibition to the souvenir shop. "He sounds more like a fountain than a painter, or more like an animal who holds a paintbrush. If, according to that same writer in the catalog, Renoir's brush was part of him, then maybe he didn't even have to hold it." So you can see that I was out of my insecurity, in part, came the desire to listen to what other people had to say. And I was very fortunate that I landed on 3 such different conversations. So I was and am insecure. I don't think you can be a writer and not be insecure. I was reading, I think it was René Daumal who said one should always be writing and never be a writer. And I think that's a good distinction. Words are also insecure. They're slippery and they can be used well, better, even better, and poorly so that the word means nothing. And one says, "What is that person saying?" Sometimes a word is applied like a label for a mass of information that needs much more precise rendering. What is that person saying? There are words for saying those things that can't be said. Fully known, described, or defined, ambiguous, indescribable, unknowable, ineffable, indefinable, oblique, vague, and inerrable, which means that which cannot be narrated, that which cannot be narrated or cannot be told. Narrative is strictly a telling. What does that mean, that which cannot be told? Those are the stories I want to write. And so I'm going to read one page from American Genius, a comedy, my last novel, in which I'm having my character is in some institution somewhere, and it's never named. And she's thinking about beauty, which is something that we all think about and we all worry about and then think about again and so on. Beauty is disputed, its relevance to society whose values are temporary. Beauty rises and falls like stock on Wall Street, since its fate is tied to the changing shape of history, crafted by good and bad times and events, and it's either an impediment or an incitement, since it's always arguable how beauty behaves and functions for what reasons, yet it instills itself with reasonable and unreasonable demands, holds sway, or merely creates an insistent pressure. I have renounced its claims and been possessed and dispossessed by it, or I have embraced it as a renegade, disruptive hero. Once I carved the word beauty into a large bar of ivory soap and floated the soap in a bath of hot water to efface the letters. It was beautiful. Once I wrote the word beauty 1,000 times on a green board, but the word didn't become nonsense. Once, late at night, I shouted the word beauty over and over. It never sounded ugly to me. And oddly, I could repeat it again and again without its becoming nonsense. It's only a word, I said to myself, but I couldn't negate what had happened because I can't pretend something didn't happen. I told myself it was because the concept joins to something beyond me, or so much a part of me I couldn't recognize it. Maybe an obstacle to my peace of mind. I like beautiful faces, though what kinds I think beautiful may not be anyone else's, yet often they are. So a perplexing consensus on beauty, when its value is regularly disputed, begets trouble. History is not beautiful, not elegant, the way design and formulae can be. I prefer a beautiful chair and beautiful skin and beautiful fabric. In a corner of my sleeping room, like a soldier, stands a bolt of beautiful fabric, which my father and his beloved brother designed and manufactured. Golden threads are woven through it, a silk and nylon material. Junior may have once carried it in his sturdy arms, and the fabric shimmers when sunlight hits it, or when at night I shine my lamp on it. I call it the fabric monolith, at attention and on duty, near my bed, where I sleep, sometimes fitfully. An object never done, but complete in itself and, in a sense, finished. I have thought of designing and commissioning a shirt from it, but then I would have to undo the bolt. Worse, cut into it with a big scissors, in the process ruining the integrity of the fabric monolith, which may never have been unrolled except in the presence of my father, his brother, their salesman, and Junior. Now I long to unfurl it across a long, wide wooden work table and hear the whooshing noise it emits when it breathes. But I don't. I satisfy myself by imagining it. I can always imagine it without ever ruining it. In any form I write, fiction, poem, essay, theory, my medium is words, and they are indifferent to form. Here's an essay I wrote recently on writing. It's called Doing Laps Without a Pool. I hope some of its questions and assertions also respond to questions around and about the making and categorizing of visual art, and also apply to other aspects of life. Doing laps without a pool. In the beginning, there seems just one way to write it, the way it comes out, and then that way becomes a debate contested most essentially in and by its writer. Hopefully, a writer reads and will become more conscious of decisions in style and form. Some writers make these choices more consciously than others. The decisions mark differences in fiction, though whether they might be experiments can't be assumed, certainly not by their authors. The term experimental and others that categorize or characterize writing have, for me, lost their explanatory power. Mainstream, conventional, innovative, progressive, whatever value they hold or once held, the notions are vague and they lack agreed-upon meanings among writers, readers, and critics. Rather than being descriptive, the characterizations are predictive and can mark expectation, both writers and readers. Also, they are outmoded and unhelpful, even as heuristic tools. Still, they survive like the human appendix without usefulness. Lacking other concepts, we writers are the term's hapless recidivists. If a writer has an idea about how writing should act or what a reader should experience, it can occupy the writing, which then might foreground the writer's beliefs and a priori aesthetic preoccupations, which then might preclude a sensation for a reader of its newness, even when writing is not technically new, as most isn't. A writer's discovering or discerning a way to write it, whatever that is, finding a style, structure, subject to realize it through his or her capacities and sensibilities, lies outside of proscription. It's not that any of us can, with clairvoyance, recognize our ensnarement in and by language or in the grand, middling, and small narratives that construct our lives. But it is a writer's most essential work to be conscious of the act of writing, of enabling words to do as much as possible, for instance. Now, here's another quote from Virginia Woolf from that same essay. Our business is to see what we can do with the old English language as it is. How can we combine old words in new orders so that they create beauty and that they tell the truth? That is the question. Words hate anything that stamp them with one meaning or one attitude. What is our nature but to change? It is because the truth they try to catch is many-sided. They convey it by being many-sided, dashing this way and that. Thus they mean one thing to one person, another thing to another person. Sometimes finding the best word, best way of saying it, at least to the writer's mind, can be less accommodating to a reader. Difficulty is always relative. But how a writer's trials, errors, and successes add or not to a body called literature draws consensus in one time that might be denied in another. Believing in how it should be written, a way to write, also bedevils reasons to write. For me, the necessity to figure out how to accomplish a story or novel pushes me on. Many writers talk about sensing necessity in fiction, feeling it in a story, in its writing, which does not imply subject, psychology, relevance, or reason, since nonsense can have necessity in the way it's written. Harry Matthews once remarked, and I paraphrase, "It's not what you write about, it's how you write it." This is the ineffable which makes writing about writing so hard. Unquestioned adherence to any dictates about arcs, character development, fragmentation, dramatic tension, use of semicolons or adjectives, closure, character development or assassination, resolution or anti-closure, to any dictates, to any MFA workshop credos or their antithesis for a novel, story, poem, essay, will generate competent, often unexciting work, whether called mainstream, conventional, progressive, or experimental. These products will have been influenced by or derived from, almost invariably and without exception, established or earlier work, their predecessors. In writing, and I'm using a lot of quotes here, like derivativeness, except in extreme cases, is a cagey issue, since all things flow from others. Discontinuities emerge from a writer's objections, conscious and unconscious, to earlier literary approaches. But contemporary art and writing can be thoughtless or mindful reinventions, dull or highly creative imitations, resonant and generative reworkings. New work can also glide, skip, or jump off of culture's secure bases and revamp them remarkably, keeping the racket, just restringing it. It's assumed there's less conformity in experimental fiction. But what constitutes a genuine experiment in an experimental text? An argument might go, a true paradigm shift will model what follows, and these accumulate and accrete to the next. So a convention results from earlier breaks or reformulations, Gertrude Stein's, Jane Bowles's, Henry James with the novel, and augmented over time and by practice, the experimental novel becomes recognizable, no longer really an experiment, but in the spirit or school of such. Innovative is used instead of experimental, and that's often allied with fresh, edgy, inventive, novel, groundbreaking. Then there's unique. But how many formulations can be? The literary novel, what is it? Uncommercial? Conventionally experimental? And how is literariness measured? And then there's progressive. What is progressive writing? Is it in its subject matter, politics, or style, or all three? Can there be a measure for it, whatever it might be, in its own time, or before readers experience it? The indeterminate and indefinable, elemental to fiction, complicate any naming. Inexorably, all writing fits into genres, like the genre-bending novel, which has itself become a genre. Wishing for scientific and technological discoveries or an avant-garde to save and advance society and culture is futile. This wish supports, in the sense modernism did, the idea of more advanced and superior articulations in writing of a loftier civilization, less bellicose, more civilized, and an expanded human consciousness, progress. But the machinations and machines of the 20th century should have eviscerated this understandable illusion, since by mid-century, progress ate its babies alive. So no progress in literature or art, only differences and changes, contemporary responses and aesthetic variations. Mrs. Dalloway is not better than Middlemarch. Zeno's conscience isn't better than Augustine's confession, St. Augustine's confessions, and the other way around. If the reader accepts, as I do, that no object has inherent value, that it is remade by passing generations of readers and viewers, the erratic history of the worth and reputation of authors' work attests to this. No form can be privileged, no judgment eternal. Consciousness in all its manifestations will come to be represented variously by each generation for their different days and nights. Since what is around people, what we see, hear, watch, exist in, affects our being and becoming, our reactions and what we make, as our psychology shift within parameters of basic needs, new hungers, and expanded wants. Human beings are fantastic and horrifyingly adaptive creatures, fashioning tools or retooling, making nice, making war, building up and tearing down. Things change, they stay the same. The world changes and doesn't simultaneously. Writers rue rewriting old narratives, despair that there's nothing new under the sun except, say, a depleted ozone level, which will engender a plethora of apocalyptic myths. Still, an object can be shaken up and turned on its head. A word set beside another can create a shattering collision, like John Milton's use of gray as an adjective in his poem Lycidas. Still, fiction will thrive primarily through readers' imaginative capacities, which means that how and what we read is ultimately more crucial than how and what we write. Those of us who are practitioners live in interesting times. Writing now is like doing laps without a pool. Maybe we wail in an aesthetic void or shout in a black hole, life's empty or dense, we can't know what we're in. Fish probably don't know they're in water. Who can be certain, though? But uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. It may point writers toward other registers of meaning, other articulations. Complacency is writing's most determined enemy, and we writers and readers have been handed an ambivalent gift, doubt. It robs us of assurance while it raises possibility. Fiction is the enemy of facts. Facts are not the same thing as truths. Fiction is inimical to goals, resistant to didacticism, its moralities question morality, its mind changes, while explanations crash and burn, mocking explicability. Fiction also claims that seeming lies can be true because everything we say and don't say, know and don't know, tells and reveals. Novels and stories are not training manuals. Their information is gleaned by readers in their terms and for their own uses, often not easily comprehended in part or whole or never. Knowing the plot of Oedipus Rex, say, doesn't change its powerful effects, for its enunciation of the unspeakable, the way it's written, and its evocation of the mystery and tragedy of human desire overwhelm any one of its parts. A great story is necessarily greater than its plot. Writing is like life. There are many ways of doing it. Survival depends on flexibility. Anything can be on the page. What isn't there now? So that's how I was approaching the question of category in fiction, which has been very disturbing to me for a long time. And as you can see, I'm trying to get rid of it, and yet I don't know what to replace it with. And I don't think most of us do. I wanted to say something about failure and or success in writing, specifically whether or not what I write in relationship to art offers anything, is helpful to an understanding of the art I write to. And note that I said to and not about. The final essay Craig Owens wrote, which appeared in 1989 in Art in America, made an extremely significant point. Craig suggested that rather than talking about or writing about others, we try to talk to others. That idea has become a dictum for me. To, not about. Gertrude Stein, in What Are Masterpieces and Why Are There So Few of Them, wrote, I am I because my little dog knows me, but, creatively speaking, the little dog knowing that you are you, and you're recognizing that he knows, that is what destroys creation. That is what makes school. Picasso once remarked, I do not care who it is that has or does influence me as long as it's not myself. Craig's idea of to, not about, joins with Stein's for me and encourages my writing fiction. We always use ourselves, of course. There is no escape from that, I'm afraid. But I don't want to write about myself or about anyone or anything else. So success in writing or failure for me means how far I can get from myself to understand, to observe, to write to art, ideas, and persons. I'm not sure what my stories do. I look at and to visual material and try to discover why it is what it is. Why is this object what it is, I ask myself. Why is this medium? Why is it in this medium? And what is it communicating, trying to say, and on and on. In a way, why does it exist? A question dear to many hearts. And then I wanted to read as my last written piece from a story I wrote about Jeff Koons's work, specifically, mostly the Michael Jackson and Bubbles piece. And I chose it because most of you, I'm sure all of you, know Koons's work to some extent. And I was trying to think about Koons's work in a different way, within a narrative. So I'm just going to read parts of this. This is called Madame Realism Lies Here. Madame Realism awoke with a bad taste in her mouth. All night long she'd thrashed in bed like a trapped animal. The white cotton sheets twisted around her frenetic, sleeping body, and like hands nearly strangled her. Madame Realism pounded her pillow, beating it into weird shapes, and when finally she lay her head on it, she smothered her face under the blanket to muffle the world around her. She wanted to tear herself from the world, but it was tearing at her. She wasn't ever sure if she was sleeping, even when she was. Her unconscious escapades exhausted her. All restless night, her dreams plagued her, both too real and too fantastic. She was in a large auditorium, and a work of art spoke for her. Much as she tried, she couldn't control any of its utterances. Everywhere she went, people thought that what it said was the final word about her. When they didn't think it spoke for her, they thought it spoke about them. They objected violently to what it was saying and started fighting with each other. Kickboxing, wrestling. The event was televised, and everything was available worldwide. It was also taped, a permanent record of what should have been fleeting. Mortified, Madame Realism fled, escaping with her life. In another dream, a sculpture she'd made resembled her. It didn't look exactly like her, but it was close enough. Friends and critics didn't notice any significant differences, but she thought it was uglier. Still, what was beauty? Ugliness. Maybe she'd done something to herself, a nose job or facelift, her friends speculated. But the statue was much taller, bigger than life, everyone said, with an exaggerated, cartoonish quality. People confused her with it, as if they were identical. Madame Realism kept insisting, "We're not the same," but no one listened. She rubbed the sleep out of her eyes. Everything was a test. Every morning an examination. In her waking life, as in her dreams, she concocted art that confronted ideas about art. So life wasn't easy. Few people wanted to be challenged. But Madame Realism had principles and beliefs, though she occasionally tried to disown them, and her vanity made her vulnerable. What if she didn't look good? Still, she didn't want to serve convention like a craven waiter, or fear being cheap and brazen either. Things had no regard for the claims of authors and patrons, and Madame Realism's work wasn't her child. But inevitably, it was related to her, often unflatteringly. Sometimes she was vilified as if she were the mother of a bad kid who couldn't tell the truth. But what if art can't tell the truth? What if it lies? Madame Realism did sometimes, shamelessly, recklessly. She remembered some of her lies, and the ones she didn't could return, misshapen, to undo her. Uncomfortable now, she stretched, and the small bones in her neck cracked. The body aligns itself, realigns itself, she'd heard, which comforted her for reasons she didn't entirely understand. What if, Madame Realism mused, finally arising from her messy bed with an acrid metallic taste in her mouth, what if art was like Frankenstein? Mary Shelley's inspiration for Frankenstein was the golem, which legend goes, was a creature fashioned from clay by a Rabbi Lowe in the 17th century. The figure was meant to protect the Jewish people, but once alive, the golem ran amok, turned against its creator, and became destructive. Rabbi Lowe was forced to destroy the golem. Madame Realism walked creakily into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water. She put the kettle on the stove. She always did the same thing every morning, but this morning she felt awkward. Then she walked into the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. She discovered a terrible sight. What she had dreamed had happened. There was a cartoonish quality to her. All her features were exaggerated. Her breasts had disappeared and her chest tripled in size. Her ass was so big she could barely sit on a chair. Her biceps were enormous, and she flexed them. It was strangely thrilling and terrifying. Tremulous and determined, she walked into her studio, actually shuffled, for with so much new weight on her, she couldn't move quickly as she once had. Carrying the burden of new thoughts, she reassured herself, was weird and ungainly. Just as soon as she said that to herself, all the art in her studio metamorphosed. It was not hers, but she recognized the impulse to make it. Still, she was shocked. She'd never used rubber or stainless steel before. Then, like golems, these monstrous pieces, which is what she thought of the invaders, became animated. A large inflatable flower pushed her into a chair, and her ass was so big she fell on the floor. When she looked up, there was a ceramic double figure staring down at her. It was Michael Jackson and one of his pet monkeys. Michael was crying. She'd never seen him cry before. Then he said, "Call me tasteless. It doesn't matter. What you expect to see is just as tasteless. What is taste? Educated love? Don't you love me? After all this time, don't you know me? Aren't we friends? Don't be surprised. I might be Michelangelo's David. I am popular, and so was David. He protected his people and fought Goliath and won." "Well," Madame Realism heard herself say aloud, "do you know the one about?" She wanted to say something about ideas, but she couldn't stop kidding around. Michael Jackson and his beloved monkey became silent, and suddenly she was overcome by a copulating couple. Madame Realism felt embarrassment creep over her new big body. The lovers disengaged, and the beautiful woman spoke. "Against death I summon lust and love. Lust is always against death. It is life. Without my freely given consent, and with it totally, I'm driven to mark things out of an existence that will end against its will. It's a death I cannot forge, predict, violate, or annihilate. Ineluctable death is always at the center and, like birth, the only permanent part of life, central to meaning and meaninglessness. And to this meaning and meaninglessness, I ask, why shouldn't you look at us in the act of love? What happens to you when you do? The sculpted male partner nodded in agreement. The couple moved off and threw each other to the ground. Madame Realism knew the word pornography meant the description of the life and activities of prostitutes, of what was obscene, and that there were drawings of prostitutes' activities in orgy rooms back in ancient times. Even now, the rooms weren't supposed to be seen. But what shouldn't be seen, and why? Legendary New Yorker Brendan Gill, known as a man of taste, was asked why he watched pornography. He said, because it gives me pleasure. Pleasure, Madame Realism said aloud. Pleasure. Her biceps flexed. With that, an enormous and brilliant painting appeared on the wall. Unlike the sculptures that had conversed with her, the painting remained mute. But it looked at her. It looked at her with an enormous, unblinking eye, and it stared at her as if she were an object. It seemed to be the viewer, so she was being viewed by art. This had never happened before, she thought, with peculiar wonder. She felt naked in a fresh and violent way. Art was a golem. It had taken over. It had a life of its own, and now she feared it was assessing her. What did it say about her? To be winning, she told it a joke, which more or less popped out of her mouth, but the painted eye kept looking. She followed its gaze and realized the painting wasn't really seeing her. She wanted it to, but it didn't. It stared past her, perhaps into the future or the past. It didn't speak, though maybe it spoke to her. It didn't offer an opinion of her. It said nothing at all about her. Nothing. Madame Realism swooned and fainted. When she awoke, everything was as it had been in her studio. Her work was back in its place. She was no longer cartoonish. She thought, my work can't protect me. I will be true to my fantasies even when I don't recognize them. What I make is not entirely in my power, as conscious as I try to be. It's always in my hands and out of my hands, too. I like to look at things because they make me feel good, even when they make me feel bad. I'm proud to be melancholic. I like to make things because they usually make me feel good. I am not satisfied with the world, so I add to it. My desires are on display. What I make, I love and hate. Forever after, and this is strange to report, maybe unbelievable, Madame Realism saw things differently. Like Kafka's hunger artist, who fasted for the carnival public, who watched him waste away, until one day when no one was looking or cared that he was starving, he wasted into nothing and died, she did what she wanted. She made a spectacle of herself from time to time, mostly in her work, trying to tell the truth and finding there's no truth like an untruth. She kept pushing herself to greater and greater joys and deprivations, which were invariably linked, and like any interesting artist who can't help herself and is enthralled to her own discoveries, Madame Realism shocked herself most over and over again. Thanks very much.
Well, writing to, not about art, I think that says it probably as well as it can be said. And also that whole notion that comes in with that, I mean, that goes against most ideas about criticism, that assume that the art doesn't need it. It needs the art, but the art doesn't need it. So you do get this, I mean, certainly in those passages, this Frankenstein golem aspect when the art is looking at you and when you're talking to it as if it has agency, has intention. That, I mean, normal criticism assumes that the vector is always in the other direction.
I don't mean that from the perception of the viewer, one can think that art speaks to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that it's going to say the same thing to everyone, but it doesn't actually, I don't think in writing that I determine the meaning of what I write. I try to control it to some extent. I'm very conscious of language and rhythms and all of that. But I think ultimately I can't make the meaning until it's read. And so as, let's say, if I function as a critic, I want to have some kind of dialogue with the work, but it's from my point of view.
You're writing the whole dialogue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this case with Madame Realism, it's her fantasy. She has this dream, and then this dream comes true. And, you know, when I was writing that section about the painting looking at and not seeing, that was also about its indifference, in a way, to an individual. And also that people sometimes think that what the art is that they like says something about them in a you know, kind of just a prosaic sense. You put X over your couch and that says something about you, but what if it doesn't? And you know, maybe it's just there, but it doesn't necessarily say anything about you. So I was trying to think about those ideas too.
Well, now you've upset the whole apple cart.
So I'm a much more conventional critic than you thought.
I'd like to hear a little more about the origins of Madame Realism and the switch, and about this relation to Craig Owens and how that evolved.
The story. It's funny because having used the word realism, I've been asked about, am I a realist? Is Madame Realism a realist? And but the way it came about, it's sort of a silly story, but in 1984 I got a phone call from, I forget who it was, and it was a he, and he said, we're doing a magazine of surrealism. Would you like to contribute? And I said no. I mean, I was polite. I said no. And I got off. I said no, and I hung up the phone. No. I said no, and I got off the phone, and I thought, a magazine of surrealism, what is he talking about? You know, it's 1984. You know, it's like that movie, The 20th Century. But this is the 20th century, but being on that train called the 20th century. So then I started thinking about Madame Realism, and I had talked with Merritt Oppenheim for an interview. The first interview I ever did was of Merritt Oppenheim, and she talked a little bit about the position of women in surrealism. And I just thought it would be funny to have a retort to surrealism and to make it Madame Realism. So I mean, that was just my little pun, and of course nobody ever has thought, is this, you know, and I just, you know, you always worry, is it too obvious or something, but in any case, only to me, you know. But, and then, so I did that little book with Kiki. I asked her to, I had written the story, and I asked her to make the drawings for it. And then Craig Owens asked if I would contribute to this the symposium that they were doing and you know, people like Linda Nochlin and Benjamin Buchloh, you know, people who were really art historians were contributing to it, and I felt extremely uneasy. And he said, well, we know you're a fiction writer. So then I thought, okay, I'm a fiction writer, write fiction. And when that came out, it was a number of art critics said to me, how did you get to do that like that? And I said, I just did it, you know. But
a lot of artists have asked you to write catalog or monograph pieces, and you've done. I mean, a lot of these that are in the collection come from that. What do you tell them when, or what did you tell them then in the
Well,
beginning?
I told them that I didn't want to write a regular essay, that I wanted to write a story. And let's see, the first person to ask after I did something in Art in America, that was 1986. Then it was somebody at, God, I'm forgetting his name, at the New Museum. He was doing a show called Fake, and I wrote a piece for him. And then every year for a while, I did a Madame Realism story for Art in America. Betsy Baker was just great about that, and she let me do it. Actually, I think when the first Madame Realism came out in Art in America, some enraged artist wrote in about how dare you let Lynne Tillman, she knows nothing about art. It's sort of hilarious. So.
You often have said that these stories are analogs, that they're analogs to the art. What do you mean by that?
Well, I meant that they're kind of running alongside of, in response to, analogous to. And again, as I said, I wasn't being disingenuous. I do really wonder if these things are successful in those ways. I think they work as stories, but whether they really contribute to a way of thinking about the art that I'm thinking about, I don't know. And I think some things are work better than others do in that sense. But I'm not at all against, I think I should say, I'm not at all against conventional art criticism or art history. It's just what I could do. I didn't want to do what I couldn't do. I wanted to do what I might be able to do differently.
But you've also written a lot of essays.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, once you said mental space is maybe all I really have. It's maybe what an essay is, and to that extent that I have it, I've tried to use it. I guess that was in the introduction to the collection. But can you talk a little about how the essay is different
from writing, from when it really is strictly fiction, although I do try to blur the lines sometimes. I think I'm speaking to a reader much more directly when I write an essay. If you notice in the way that I was speaking to all of you when I was reading from my prepared little speech, I was really trying to talk directly to you. And I sometimes can be I think Ed White said to me about one of the essays I wrote a long essay on Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth. And by the way, visual artists should read Wharton, because her sense of structure and her detail in scenes, the physical object as in relationship to a character, is so important. That in that essay he said you don't, how did he put it? It was like, I don't finesse something. I go directly to it. And I suppose in writing an essay, I'm trying to get to it. I'm not, and in fiction, something else is going on. I'm working with other ideas too.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed something when I was thinking about this evening and what I would say, and I realized that I used to use strings of words, 4 or 5 words, different adjectives or different, and to say something sometimes. And I did that once in one of the pieces. And I don't do that anymore. But I think I was trying very much to figure out how to bring all that doubt and all the the sense that words are slippery, that words can bump up against each other and you can have slight variations on meaning. And I don't do that anymore because I don't really think that it does that. In other words, one word is slippery enough, one or two words. You don't, and I was relying on that too much. That's what I noticed when I was working for this. I mean, it's always important to keep being critical of your work.
This is probably a completely unfair question, but I know that you studied painting and history at Hunter.
Yeah.
What kind of painter do you think you would have been?
Aha. Well, I'm very pleased to say that one of my former teachers, Ron Gorchov, a great painter, is in the audience tonight, and it's such a thrill for me. I don't know. I had little moments, I think. But I don't. I did. I was an English literature major and an American history minor, but I took all my electives in studio art, and I think part of why I have the relationship to writing to art that I do is because of having had a little bit of practice in it, and so that, you know, approaching a canvas, or if it's a rectangle, if it's a reptile or a rectangle or a
They're slippery.
I once actually painted a watercolor in your class that was, I thought it was abstract, but then it looked like an alligator in a pool. I don't know if you remember that, but it either looked like that or a floating turd. I'm not sure, but it was. But I don't know. I don't think I would have been a very good painter. But I enjoyed it. It was thinking spatially. Was so different from the way you think about things on the page, and it was a great freedom for me. And I also learned something about being an artist. I mean, being around English professors, English literature professors, didn't actually give me that handle. In fact, one of them, I was taking a course in modern British literature, and we were doing Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses. And the teacher said to us on the first day of class, he's a tiny red-haired man, and he looked out at us and he said, by the time Joyce was your age, he'd already written The Dubliners. And I hated him. I absolutely hated him. That was not very encouraging. So I don't think I would have been a very good painter.
When you're writing something like the piece that you read from to Kuhn's sculpture, how do you keep going back to the work as this is writing, or do you take off from a perception and the writing makes the associative flow?
How do you mean go back to the work?
Well, do you have an image of it that you keep going back to?
Yes, I do keep looking at it.
Almost always with.
I try to have it around me.
Mm-hmm.
But in that piece, I was really trying to figure out, you know, I mean, just general questions that were raised about Jeff Koons' work, about pornography, obscenity, about why he would use Michael Jackson and Bubbles, and I was trying to converse with those problems, and through Madame Realism's fantasies, in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
her dreams.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I do keep going back. I did one piece, story for Ronnie Horn, which was, she had done these gouaches of maybe a phrase on it. And it's very hard. Not only is it hard to writing about words, to use words with words, but when an artist uses words, and Ronnie Horn's a very good writer also, In this, it was just sort of like snippets of language. And I was trying to figure out what it was trying to do, what it was trying to communicate, and the words were images. They were images, and they also kept being words, you know. So I don't know if that one was successful either, but I got into this elaborate story, this guy trying to mail a letter. I don't know. It was, it was a very nutty kind of piece. One of the things I think about Barbara Kruger's work is that the sentences or the phrases that she might have in a work could be the headline for a story, or could be the title for something else. And I began to think about what are the common tales that we watch on television or read in the newspaper, just that happen. So I took stuff out of newspapers, and I thought about some sitcoms, and I converted some stuff that I just heard people talk about, and I tried to make the shortest kind of story I could, and something that's quite familiar also. And yeah, in a way, they're stories that can't be told because they seem so uncanny. They seem so resistant to our being able to understand them. Like why these brothers kept huge pythons that eventually killed them, you know, in an apartment in the Bronx. You'd have to write a novel, at least, to develop a character who would do such a thing. And it is just a news item, and we're surrounded by items like that all the time. And you don't get a full story. So these are the sort of half-assed stories that we're, you know, surrounded by, I guess.
In critical fiction, Critical Self, you tell us how you already knew from a very early age that you wanted to become a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, I guess for me, it came a little bit later. I'm in Levi's graduate program. And I remember that when I told somebody about my plans to follow this program, they looked at me very skeptical, and they asked me, oh, well, how do you know you're a good writer? And I heard you talking about that you don't think you would have been a good painter, and so I wondered, like, how would you answer this question when somebody asks you?
How did I know?
How do you know you are a good writer?
Well, my mother questioned me too. I said to her, when I was 8, I said, I'm going to be a writer, and she said, I didn't think you had any talent. And I think discouragement can be the new encouragement, actually. I just enjoyed it. I mean, when I was 7 and 8, we were writing little essays in school. And I remember writing about Charlemagne, Charles the Great. I was so carried away, I wrote 2 essays, one Charlemagne, Man of War, and one Charlemagne, Man of Peace. I mean, even then, you know, I had a very ridiculous bent, but I think, I mean, of course, everybody who writes probably thinks they're good, and obviously not everyone is, so it's a delusion, I suppose. But I think because I enjoyed it so much, I felt I was good. I wanted to do it. And being a novelist at that time was really a big deal. And the novel was much more a part, it seemed much more an important part of culture than it does now, sadly.
I was thinking about what you said in relation to the to art versus the about art. And I was thinking, with I prefer the to position. the talking to, the conversational with the art, and that with that, there's this kind of openness that is very different than the so-called or quote-unquote serious critic, where it seems to me at least that the critic who defines themselves as a critic per se is looking for a kind of closure, like a kind of succinct position on a given work of art or a given time period or whatever. But as a writer, the dialogue is open and intentionally built to be a kind of a provocation, an endless provocation. And I was thinking about it in terms of being a writer of an experimental, innovative, uncategorical type of writing that you write, even though you call yourself or are known as a fiction writer. And I think about that in regard to poets to some degree, that we're kind of swimming in this openness. And I was thinking about that there probably is a different proportion in terms of historical real estate for someone who is invested in positioning themselves in the art world, per se, versus someone who is positioning themselves in the trajectory of literary history. If we can agree on some definition of literary. And I'm wondering, how does it feel to perhaps be swimming in this area of creativity known as literature, where there is no necessarily there isn't an end, and there is no kind of succinct way of positioning yourself, per se, when you're experimenting and you're open and talking to all of these artistic ideas.
Wow. Well, you know, there's so much that you've said, and I just want to go back to that. I think art critics and the kind of so-called serious criticism. I mean, look at Craig Owens. For me, he was. I learned so much from his work, and yes, he did take positions, but then he also moved away from positions. And Laura Mulvey is a great English critic, and she. I mean, you want people to be thinking things through and to be taking positions and to be allowed to move. I think, or move away from and not be considered flip-flopping or something like that. I mean, I think, so there are lots of people that I think have done very important work and are doing important work. They're doing really the legwork that lets somebody like me jump around, frankly. But I don't know that visual art is in so much a different condition from the kind of writing I'm interested in. I think some of this whole issue of globalism, for instance, the numbers of artists worldwide who are making work, it's very different from what I imagine it was like in the 50s, or when the art world was a very small place that didn't have to consider China or Japan or India. You know, that's very different. How do you measure yourself? In what way? What are the registers that you use? Change is much more, let's say, is de rigueur in art, and it's not in writing. Writing is very, I think, fiction is very tradition bound, and even though it's often the experiments that we point to, but it's after the fact. Gertrude Stein's essay "Composition as Explanation" is a terrific essay that really talks about why something is new and not understood, and why it then becomes a classic. But I think there are similar things. I think that artists also are swimming, doing laps without a pool. I think it's what are the standards against which you measure what you're doing, and whose voice do you want to hear talking to you about your work? whether it's visual or literary. I think there are a lot of similar problems. And as for, I love that concept, historical real estate. That you should write a poem about that. That's a brilliant idea. I think we all get bought and sold for a little while, and then who knows what happens.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi.
I'm rereading the Stein essay right now, today and yesterday, so it's nice to hear you refer to it, the composition as explanation. But that's kind of where my question is going off of Chris's. As far as who you decide to write about in a critical stance, I mean, I've spoken to Levi before about, and pardon me if I'm misquoting you, about you don't want to necessarily write critically lambasting art or take positions there. You want to be kind of giving space for more thought about a person's career or body of work over a longer time, and having a conversation with Martin Creed or whoever, for instance. But do you feel a certain drive to write about your contemporaries, or do you work based on assignments? Or, I mean, what do you feel your role as a critic is in kind of giving a context to art that's being made right now, or right at the time of which you were writing about it, or to it?
I think one thing would be, what I feel my obligation would be, is to write as well as I can and to think as hard as I can about what it is that I'm looking at. And whatever honesty is, I would like to bring that to my writing. Mostly, I think almost always, I've been asked to write for someone. And it's been my good fortune to be asked by people. Well, I think, there's, people don't go to you, an artist would come to you unless he or she felt that there was some kind of sympathy or comprehension that you might bring to. Sometimes I've had a conversation with an artist at a party about their work, and then I hear from them a year later. I'm pretty curious about people's lives and what they do and why they do it. And so I can be quite annoying, I think, in different places because, but I really am very curious, and I think that's part of why I want to figure out what it is that this thing is in front of me. And I don't know that it is criticism, and I don't know that it's not criticism. I'm not really sure what criticism is, frankly. Except I know that I want criticism. Some writer friends of mine, down on critics and all of that. I'm so happy if somebody actually wants to write about my work. I mean, if they say just idiotic things, I'm not so happy. But mostly, I'm glad somebody wants to take up what I've just spent 5 years on or something. That's good. So I think the critic's role is an important one, and I think interpretation. It's funny, I was thinking about Sontag's against interpretation, but even that's an interpretation. So you can't really avoid it. People are meaning machines. We're trying to figure things out all the time. We are interpreting everything.
Hi, sorry about that. Sorry to return to this, but I am really curious.
I can't hear it so well.
I'll bring it closer.
Okay. Right.
Sorry to return to this question, but I am curious. Did you ever speak with Owens about the idea of writing to a work? And as a follow-up, or to ask the question behind the question, is how would you describe the reception of your writing to a work among a generation of critics who might have seen themselves writing in the wake of Roland Barthes, and so would understand their work to have a certain implicit fictionality about it?
No, I don't think I ever did discuss that with Craig. As I said, that was his last work, and it was quite a short piece, and he was pretty sick by then. I think when it came out, I probably told him how much I liked it and that it was important to me, but I don't think we discussed it at any length, unfortunately. There's so many conversations I wish I could still have with him. He was really, really just brilliant. As for in the wake of critics writing in the wake of Barthes and how they respond to my work, there hasn't been really any written criticism of Madame Realism. So what art critics think about, or other pieces I've written on subjects that have to do with art, I don't know. I really don't know. This work is not read in the literary world, that's for sure. The literary world is basically ignorant about contemporary art, and that's a sad fact. Sometimes they use artists in narratives, but they really don't have any idea of how artists make work. But I think you should say something about it, because that question was, in a sense, a rhetorical question a bit. Do you know? Do you have an idea? Come on.
Not a rhetorical question at all.
Okay,
but I was curious to what degree folks might have seen your work being so much or so distinct from their own. If they were recognizing that you were working within, say, the genre of fiction, what, and maybe it wasn't even recognizable at the time, and even in common conversation among your colleagues and friends, but did they actually, were there connections that they saw? I mean, you showed up in so many contexts, among, say, blasted allegories, where one would suspect that folks would have seen connections, even if they weren't articulated in print.
Really, there was among my closer friends, that people would respond sometimes. The only art critic who ever said anything to me directly about a Madame Realism piece was Benjamin Buchloh. I wrote a piece for Art in America on Freud's collection of antiquities, and there was a traveling exhibition of that, and the curator did not like what I wrote at all, because I think she expected that it was going to be what she would consider a serious essay in Art in America on these antiquities of his, was what had been on his desk, and I'm very much interested in Freud and psychoanalysis, so it was a kind of wonderful project for me. And he's the only art critic who ever said anything to me directly. He liked it. That's what he told me. But as I think I've told Levi that this work I do has basically been under the radar, except among the 500 people or 1,000 people in the art world who might be interested enough to read it.
What about the notion of writing with? Would there be a distinction between writing to and writing with?
Well, writing with would assume that I know the other people or have some sense of, it's a bit like we.
But I guess what I'm thinking about is when you're writing, say, about a work, like thinking about Koons, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in some sense, there's a conversation, isn't there, with the work itself, that
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of I mean, somehow the writing too, just thinking about it, has a sort of still a somewhat of a, and I'm not saying this in any way as a criticism of
Go
you,
ahead.
but has a kind of you know, from me to you. It's a kind of there's a kind of it's a kind of delivering something to somebody, as
It's not
opposed
per-
to a
yeah,
more of
right,
a kind
I
of a back and
understand.
forth.
It's not a perfect formulation, but at all, and I see what you mean about with. I wanted to get away from about, because when you write fiction, you don't write about characters. You write the character, and it's not like it's avoiding generalizations to say you're speaking to this character is speaking to you. And I don't mean like some Shirley MacLaine kind of idea of being spoken to. But I see what you mean about with, although it would presume that I had some knowledge of really what the artwork was trying to do, and I don't. I can only have some speculations. Annette, Mr. Gorchov wanted to say something.
Thanks. This is not it. You spoke about, I think you quoted Freud
Yeah.
saying, I have to paraphrase what you said, what his quote was, that making art is
Oh,
is
about
comparable to
hysterics, yes.
hysterical fantasies.
That's right, that's right.
And actually responding to art would be in kind. And a lot of it, and
I don't think people can hear you.
I think responding, seeing art could give one fantasies that might resonate with the. It wouldn't be the same fantasy the artist has.
Right.
It a couple times, well, especially with the Michael Jackson Bubbles. I didn't know whether it was a dream or a fantasy,
Right.
but it made me think of that.
Right. Right.
And in terms of Freud, the idea of slips of the tongue,
Yes.
and you don't have many because your diction is good, but they stick out when you do.
Right.
Now, I think that it could have been a slip of my ear, but when you, and I don't know what it was about, you said the word craftsmanship,
Uh-huh.
and I heard craftsmanship,
Oh,
which is a word I'd never heard before,
craftsmanship.
which resonated. It was great.
Well.
You didn't mean that, though, did you?
No, I meant craftsmanship,
Okay,
but it's
good.
very hard to say.
Yes.
Very, very hard to say, but I'm glad you pointed that out. But there's the difference.
I needed to introduce that with Freud.
Thank you. And Mr. Gorchov was talking about how there's a slippage from dream to fantasy in that Madame Realism piece that the Jeff Koons one, and yeah, there is. I mean, she's awakening from these dreams, and then she has the fantasy that the dream has in fact happened. And that's interesting, too, for me to read that, which I wrote in 2000. And I wouldn't use dreams so much anymore. I mean, I haven't used dreams in a long time. I used to use them more. So, you know, you change. You keep on changing in your own writing. I think did she?
Yes, going back to your essay about lapses without a pool, or lapse without pool, and I believe in that there was a mention of beauty and truth. And with respect to, first of all, do you think it's a...
That was Virginia Woolf. I was quoting her, yeah.
Yeah, you were quoting her, exactly. And I was wondering whether in that essay, what your thought about the position of the writer / artist, is that specific to our time? yes or no. And then I wondered what your reaction would be to something that Anne Temkin wrote, that the contemporary artists disavow transcendent goals like truth and beauty. And I wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, capital T truth and capital B beauty. When Virginia Woolf writes about it, you know, given her work, if you've read, let's say, Orlando, everything keeps shifting. She's not going to settle on one position, and she doesn't think words do. So, and the concept of beauty, I mean, I think about it a lot, but it's something that when I want to write something that I think is beautifully done, it's not necessarily going to be a beautiful thought. It's going to be beautiful in a conventional, I don't even know what the word is, I mean, but it'll be something to me that works for the story. It might be incredibly crude. I just finished a story whose main character is named Tiny, although he's quite tall. And the story is called Tiny Struggles. And there's a lot of kind of crude thought in it. But by the end of working on this very, very hard for a while, I felt that it was, in my terms, beautiful. In other words, it was as good as I could do it, and it did what I wanted it to do.
My question is
About
yeah,
yes.
transcended
No, I think
the fact that we aspire to something as opposed to
we
stay on the
live in the here and now. I don't think about what I'm doing as speaking to truths that go beyond time or beyond history, or I think we're very much in a time and place. And when I was working on the Warhol book, Warhol's Factory, I came upon something that he said, which was that he was part of his time, like rockets and television. And we are part of our time. And it speaks through us, and we try to manage it, and we make work from it, or we don't. But we're living now, but history is always with us, and the future is a desire, perhaps, and that's all collapsed in time. But no, I don't feel that anything is that. But the question of what you aspire to in your writing, that's a different question. I don't like certain kinds of obfuscation in writing. I don't like a preciousness in writing. What that is, I'd have to show you, Does that answer that well enough? Hard question.
Hi. I like that idea of writing with, because I feel that so much of your writing, not only the part that deals with art specifically, but something like Madame Realism, it's very confidential.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of us, that you're revealing, these very vulnerable self-image kinds of things, and that's a real thread that I see running through your work. And to me, that's what the best art does, right? It reveals these kinds of raw spots and raw places. So I wondered if you were consciously trying to, not that it's literally a diary, but are you consciously trying to create that kind of intimacy with the viewer or the reader? That those things seem to be on a parallel path for me, at least.
It's interesting. I don't know that, I know that when I'm writing, I'm trying to exclude everything that doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very pragmatic. It's very pragmatic.
I mean, that's what
in a way,
what
yeah.
you leave out is much more important than what you put in.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what creates the intimacy, because perhaps a reader might feel the work toward getting at it or,
Yeah,
or
really
something.
getting
Not saying
down
not
to the
saying what
quick.
doesn't need to be said. I like the idea that I might be in a conspiracy with a reader. That's because to conspire really means to breathe together. So if I could sense that the reader were breathing with the word, and I hope they do, because if they don't, it's all over. But that metaphorically breathing together it would be a nice idea.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm just curious because
Yeah.
since I do know you,
Yeah.
I often feel that sort of sense, that voice is being very intimate, and it is one of the things that keeps me coming back again and again to your work.
Thank
is that
you.
it has that real cut to the chase kind of.
Yeah.
This is the way it is. This is my day.
Right.
I make tea. I look at myself in the mirror. Those kinds of really little special details. And when you're talking about artwork, that also comes across, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Lily.
With
I think maybe that's a good place to stop. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very, very much.